Today we have the opportunity to speak with Representative Ryan Aument, who represents the 41st House District, which includes portions of Lancaster County, has served from 2011 through 2014. Representative Aument, thank you for joining us today.
Good to be here. Thank you.
I'd like you to start off and briefly describe your childhood and growing up within Lancaster County and how that has prepared you for public service.
Well, I grew up on a dairy farm in southern Lancaster County. My dad farmed for the first 10 years of my life, and so I learned a lot of valuable lessons as a child growing up on a farm. At a very early age, I had chores and responsibilities, and so learned a lot about work ethic. And you know, I grew up in a working class family. After my dad got out of farming, he was a truck driver. First was a milk truck driver, and then drove propane, and then later natural gas. And so my mother worked. She worked at a retirement community in Quarryville in the southern part of Lancaster County. And so I learned a lot about hard work, about community in the southern part of Lancaster County. Graduated from Solanco High School in 1995. And then went off to the Citadel, the military college in South Carolina, where I graduated with a degree in education in 1999, and then served for 4 years as a Army officer, as a second lieutenant, then a first lieutenant, and a captain with the 4th Infantry Division. I was an infantryman, served a mechanized infantry unit, and so really developed a real passion for public service. I was involved in politics, campaigns, would volunteer for campaigns. So I always had the interest in the political process when I was a student. Middle school and high school, worked on various campaigns and made phone calls and went door to door and enjoyed that. But I really developed a passion for public service, serving in the military. And so my desire to run and serve in elective office, to serve my community in elective office, that was really developed during the time that I was in the Army and came home from Iraq at the end of 2003, and wanted to do something where I felt as though I was able to give back and continue to serve.
Talk about those first steps, your first experiences into actual running for politics, some of the positions you held leading up to your House service.
I was given the opportunity to get involved very early when I returned home from Iraq. I returned home as the presidential election in 2004, President Bush's re-election race was taking off, and obviously was very hotly contested nationally, but in Pennsylvania. And so in Lancaster County, which is sort of at the heart of Republicanism in the state of Pennsylvania, that figured, Lancaster County figured very much in the calculations of how the president was going to be reelected and potentially carry Pennsylvania. He didn't, but we carried a very large plurality in Lancaster County. And so I was given an opportunity very early on to get involved in the president's re-election race in Lancaster County, and so took part in numerous public events where I was invited to be a surrogate speaker and speak on behalf of the president and his re-election as a veteran, to be able to talk about my experiences in Iraq and my support of the president that was enhanced because of my service in the military. I had great respect for President Bush and his response to the challenges our country faced on September the 11th and his wartime leadership. And so I was an enthusiastic supporter of his re-election. And at that same time, I was approached by friends and neighbors in Quarryville at the time to consider running for the Republican committee. So I got involved in, was elected, actually had a contested race in my first 2 Republican committee races, and was elected to serve on the committee, and was also appointed and then later elected to serve as a member of the Quarryville Borough Council. So I first got involved in local politics at a very local level and was approached by friends and neighbors, folks in my community, to run for those offices.
What influences outside of just growing up in Lancaster County influenced you to become a Republican?
Well, certainly my family. I grew up with great-grandparents and grandparents and parents who were Republican, who believed very strongly in social conservative policies, commitment to family, commitment to community. also were strong fiscal conservatives and believed in individual freedom and free markets and limited government. And so I was raised that way by my family, and through my own academic career, my time in school and later at the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina, and then through my own experiences as a soldier, involved in the private sector and industry, in the manufacturing industry, where I worked for a period of time immediately after I got out of the military, and serving on local council and having to learn to balance a budget where revenues and expenditure have to be in line. All of that continued to reinforce the principles and the views that I held of the proper role of government.
You served in local government.
Mm-hmm.
You had the opportunity to serve in state government,
Mm-hmm.
but first as a staff member.
That's right.
Talk about that experience and how that led later to you running for elected office.
Well, as I talked about when I first got home, came back to Quarryville after getting out of the United States Army, I was recruited to run for the Republican committee seat, and during my service with the Republican committee and a local Quarryville Borough Council, the summer of 2005 was the infamous pay raise here in Harrisburg. And I was, frankly, outraged that there were those who identified themselves as social and fiscal conservatives who were among the very first to sign up for, either vote for, or the very first to sign up through the pay raise through the unvouchered expenses. And also were some of the same folks that were the worst abusers of some of the perks, the per diem abuses, the mileage reimbursement, the car leases, some of the things where there was widespread abuse of that perk system. And I was outraged by this. And so in the summer of 2005, I actually took a very serious and close look at running for the state house against a sitting Republican incumbent in the 100th district in the southern part of Lancaster County. And as I was making the rounds and gauging interest in my candidacy and building support, and folks were reaching out to me and contacting me, asking me to run, through the course of those conversations, I heard there was someone else thinking about running against a sitting incumbent. And I instinctively knew that having a three-way race against a sitting Republican incumbent was a sure way to re-elect the incumbent. And so I asked, who is this person that's considering to run? And the reply by the local Solanco chairman, Scott Franz, who I was talking to, said, well, Brian Cutler. Well, I knew Brian. I went to school with Brian. In fact, Brian Cutler and I grew up a quarter-mile apart. The farm that my dad farmed was a quarter-mile down the road from where Brian and his family lived. And so I knew Brian very well. In fact, his sister, Karen, and I went to school together from kindergarten to the day we graduated. So I knew Brian and his family extremely well. Brian was 2 years older, so I knew his sister better, but certainly knew Brian and knew his family. And both of his parents passed away, had ALS and passed away. And that was very well known. His family was very well known. That situation was very well known, and the community really embraced his family during that time in the early, late 1990s. And so I told Chairman Franz, I said, well, I'm not running against Brian Cutler. And I said, so would you be willing to facilitate a meeting between Brian and I? And so Brian and I met throughout the spring, summer, and fall of 2005, essentially planning a campaign for the state house in 2006 without identifying which one of us was going to run, because we hadn't concluded which one of us was going to run. It was a fascinating experience, and really a type of experience that relationships and friendships, strong relationships and friendships are forged, because we were coming to a conclusion as to who was going to run, frankly in a way in which, remarkably, I think, looking back on it, in which ego didn't get in the way. We were genuinely trying to discern which was in the best interest of the community, which one of us was best positioned to win. And ultimately, I went to Brian and said, I think you ought to run, and I'll do anything and everything I can to help you win. My conclusion was reached. One, I believe Brian was better positioned at that time. I was single. I was considering going back to school. Brian was graduating from law school, was married, had a family, had some life experiences that I had not had, and thought that he was best positioned to run. Brian immediately asked me to run his campaign, to manage his campaign, which I did. He won a decisive victory over that incumbent in a primary election in the spring of 2006, was elected in November. He immediately asked me if I would help him, at least for a year, to get his office up and running, his district office up and running, and I agreed to do that for a short period of time.
And shortly thereafter, you had the opportunity to run for clerk of courts in Lancaster.
Mm-hmm.
And then timing, once again, was on your side again when a seat opened up in Lancaster County again,
Mm-hmm.
with our sitting incumbent Katie Chu decided not to run again in her district.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about that experience and then what motivated you to run for that seat.
Mm-hmm. I fully expected that when I passed on the opportunity to run for the House in 2005, 2006, that I was passing on that opportunity perhaps forever, certainly for the near term. Brian, I was living in the 100th district. Brian is 2 years older than I, so at the time I think Brian was 33 and I was 31. And so I just figured that I would probably be passing on that opportunity for a long time. And I was content with that. I was happy with that. And so I immediately began to think while I was working for Brian that the next step for me was to go back to school. And I was applying to law schools, was very interested in going to law school. In fact, was accepted by a number of law schools. At one, I put a seat deposit down. I was that serious about going to law school. The following fall, when in mid-December, so I went on Brian's staff officially December 1st. My recollection is around December 15th, the mid part of December, I was approached. I received a phone call from Dave Hickernell, a colleague of mine in the House, and then Katie True, who served with Dave in the House, who I knew well. Both of them suggesting that I take a look at running for Lancaster County Clerk of Courts, which was a row office in Lancaster County. That seat was coming open. The current occupant, Dale Denlinger, was not going to run again and was looking for a suitable replacement. Dave had served as Clerk of Courts. Representative Hickernell had served for 3 years as Clerk of Courts in Lancaster County. Strongly encouraged me to do it. And I remember at the time saying, well, I'm interested, but somebody's going to have to tell me what the Clerk of Courts does. And so I spent a lot of time for the next month with Dave, with Dale Denlinger, who's the sitting Clerk of Courts, and talking with others to learn about the office and whether or not I thought I could make a contribution to the residents of Lancaster County in that office. And so I did run, was elected, and so a year after serving with Brian, I took office as Clerk of Courts in January, I guess it'd be January of 2008. And at the same time, I met my wife, my now wife, Kate, school teacher at the Milton Hershey School in Hershey. And she was at that time, I think, in her first year, finishing college, was about to begin her first year at Milton Hershey. She and I were, it was a pretty quick engagement. Actually, she and I disagree over how long, because until the time we were engaged, because I think we were dating I think we were dating actually 6-7 months. To tell the story, that we were only dating about 3 or 4 months before we were engaged. But we were married and moved to the 41st House District where I now serve. We wanted to move somewhere after we were married where it was a short commute for me to get into the courthouse in Lancaster and for her driving up to Hershey to teach at the Milton Hershey School. So we first moved to East Hempfield and then later Landisville and West Hempfield where we bought a home. And that brought me into the 41st House District. And I was serving as Clerk of Courts, lived there a year and a half, when I get a phone call. Actually, it was from Brian Cutler, who said, you know, Katie's telling folks on the House floor she's not running again in 2010. This was late 2009. And I called my wife and said, Katie's not running again. I'll never forget this. This is always one of my favorite stories to tell. When I told my wife, first it was mistake number one that we had this conversation by phone. I learned a very valuable lesson. These types of conversations are best in person. But I called her on the phone and I said, Katie's telling folks she's not going to be running again for the House. Just silence on the other end of the line. And I said, you know, I may get contacted by a newspaper reporter because my name's been rumored and I'm a countywide elected official living in that district. I'm likely to get a call. If a reporter calls me, is it okay if I say we're thinking about it? And again, just silence on the other end of the phone. It seemed like 30 seconds, but it was probably only 5. She says, are we thinking about it? And so we went from that point. I love telling that because we went from that point in November of 2009 to by mid-December of 2009, Kate was the one who actually came to me, and I needed her to be at this point. She was the one that actually came to me at the end and saying, I think you need to do it. And was an absolute, was an enthusiastic supporter. I should point out that at around the same time, we found out that we were expecting our first child. So she was in the first trimester of what was a difficult pregnancy with our son Jack. At the same time that I was making this decision, so it was an interesting time in our household. But ran in 2010 and was elected to serve that November.
What strategies did you use during that campaign? Open seat is a little bit easier to run than run against an incumbent, but you've run for a countywide office before. What kind of strategies did you use to get your name further well known to run for a House seat?
Well, I guess the first in response. Very few people, and we didn't survey this, we didn't take a poll, so I don't know the answer, but I suspect if you would ask folks in Lancaster County or at any place across the state, who's your clerk of courts, a very small, slim number of folks would know who their clerk of courts. I'm sure my name ID was very low in the community at large when we started that race. So it's not a tremendous advantage there. Now certainly having been involved in Republican Party politics, knowing the folks within the county committee structure, the leaders in the community at large, I knew who those folks were. They knew who I was. And in fact, it was many of them that were approaching me as I was making the decision. My wife and I were talking about it, who were approaching me, asking me to do it. That's always been a rule for me. And I think it's a way for those of us that are in this business, frankly, to keep our pride and ego in check. I don't mean to suggest that all that are in this business have a oversized ego, but I doubt there are a few professions with more oversized egos. One of the ways that I've tried to keep that in check, frankly, is when I'm running for something, or when I have run for something, I've always tried to ensure that it was not my ambition alone, but it was others who saw a quality in me, who were encouraging me to run. And I think I followed that at each step. And the House race was no different. That folks who I respect tremendously in the political process, who were leaders in the community, leaders in the business community, neighbors and friends encouraging me to run. With the open seat, and Katie's retirement had been anticipated for some time because she had served for a long time. I think most were surprised that it came when it did, but there were a number of folks who were positioned or had been attempting to position themselves to run. And remember, I'd only moved into the district a year and a half earlier, and so there were folks with far greater experience in that district and were more well known in that district. So at the outset, there were 6 folks who had expressed interest in running for the party's endorsement. Now, at the end of the day, just 2 ran. What I actually did, and this may be a little unconventional, I don't know, because I was trying to discern for my wife and I whether the timing made sense for us to run for the House. So as I was going through that decision-making process, we decided together we were going to meet with directly each of the folks who had been rumored to be potential candidates. And in most cases, my wife and I met with them together. In some cases, it was just me one-on-one, breakfast, dinners, or what have you, and met with the other candidates. And Kate and I decided, my wife and I decided, that if we walked away from any one of those meetings thinking the person sitting across the table from me was the right man or woman for the job, or was better positioned, better qualified, and had the desire, the fire to do the job, because I think it does require a fire. It does require a drive, not just for running a campaign, but also for serving. Then we'd walk away. And at each one of those meetings, at the conclusion of those, with the exception of one, it was actually the person that was sitting across from the table from us that said, we think you ought to do it. And we'll support you. So at the end of the day, I had only one opponent for the endorsement. I won a second ballot endorsement, and then did not have a contest in the primary election. I did in the general election, but was ultimately successful.
Did it get any easier the second time for your second term?
Certainly through the party endorsement process and renomination, we worked very hard to, and it's always a challenge, I think, for any member to follow a beloved sitting incumbent. And in my case, following Katie True, who is sort of a legend in her own time, frankly, in Lancaster County, was very well regarded. Deep relationships in the community that preceded her involvement in elective politics. And Katie was well regarded. And so following her, those were big shoes to fill. And so I worked very hard to establish relationships, to work very hard to have an aggressive outreach program, an aggressive constituent service program. Some of her staff agreed to stay on with me, which I think was very, very helpful. So by the time I ran for re-election, we had the overwhelming support. I had the overwhelming support of my party, and won even in a presidential election year, as the rest of my district, which for the district that I've served, the 41st district, is one of the most demographically diverse in Lancaster County. Outside of the city of Lancaster, in terms of the voting registration, was the most narrow, Republican, Democrat, Independent. And so it is a seat that's not to be taken for granted. And in a presidential election year, and in that same election cycle, Kathleen Kane, now serving as our Attorney General, actually won the district. But I was able to win fairly easily, and I think it's because of the work that my team, our staff, put in to establishing our credibility here in Harrisburg as well as in the district.
You brought up the voting demographics of your district. Talk a little bit more detail about the district as a whole. Its industry, its people, the services that are provided there. Give us a sense of what the 44th district looks like.
I've loved serving it. I grew up, as I mentioned, in southern Lancaster County, which is very conservative, very rural. The district that I represent today in the 41st is more diverse. It's more suburban. Now there are what you would think of traditional Lancaster County in certain parts of the district, farms, more rural, but it is more suburban than many of the other districts across the county, more diverse in terms of its ethnicity, more diverse in terms of its politics. Even many of those that are self-identified as Republicans are a little more centrist than I think what you see across Lancaster County. So I was a very conservative member in a more center-right, center district. That was wonderful. And the reason I say that is I learned very early on that when I went out to public events, and I held numerous town hall events across the district, legislative breakfasts that I ran like a town hall format, and town halls in the evening, and issue-based town halls, I knew that there were going to be many folks in the room who did not necessarily see things the way that I did. And I think far too often in Harrisburg, elected officials, legislators, are surrounded by people who, by and large, tell them what they want to hear or agree with them. And then when they get back to their districts, don't often hear dissenting points of view. Well, I regularly hear dissenting points of view. And that has forced me, in a positive way, to make sure that I have a knowledge base on the issues, and that if I am confronted on an issue that I am not well prepared as I should be to deal with, I quickly go back and brush up. And I often will have folks who will challenge my thinking, which is good. It may not ultimately change my position. It sometimes it does. I have folks who will convince me through evidence that perhaps my position can't be defended, and so I've changed my perspective on things. But it's also forced me to challenge or to have my basic assumptions challenged. And I think that's good for anyone in elective office, and to be confronted with folks who disagree. And so I have enjoyed serving this district. It's about, last that I looked, it was about 52, nearly 53% Republican, 35% Democratic, and the rest independent or not affiliated, which for Lancaster County is, again, is the most diverse district outside of the city of Lancaster.
What are the issues specifically that people from your district constituents bring to you, whether you're here in the office in Harrisburg or in your district, that your staff ultimately maybe come into contact with on a regular basis? Mm-hmm.
Well, I've often told folks who inquire about the job, one of the great things, I think, is for anyone with any ounce of intellectual curiosity at all, it's the best job in the world, because the variety of issues that you confront on any given day is just incredible. Whether it's in the district or whether it's here in Harrisburg. It sometimes feels like two separate jobs in the sense that a lot of the issues that you confront in the district as my staff is meeting with constituents and doing casework with constituents is much different oftentimes than the work we do here in Harrisburg, where I'm going to committee meetings, where I'm in caucus, going to the floor, debating issues of policy, drafting legislation. Now, sometimes the two bridge, and I often have had a constituent come to me with an issue that can only be fixed through a legislative adjustment, and so that, of course, bleeds over to what we do here in Harrisburg and drafting legislation in response to an issue that a constituent has raised. But our office, I think, is very well located in the district. It's centrally located. It's along a major bus route, and so we have a large volume, a significant number of folks who come in on a regular basis who have need of our services. In many cases, they're senior citizens, and there's frustrations at all levels with various state agencies and branches, executive branches of the government, and so we're called upon to sort of break through the red tape and the bureaucratic muddle that's here. But senior citizens, I think, are the most significant demographic group that takes advantage of our services. Property tax rent rebate program, filling out those forms, helping folks with the forms they need for filing their taxes. Perhaps someone has an issue with reapplying for a driver's license and issues that involve PennDOT. But it's a wonderful job in that it's a wide variety of issues that we confront. Families coming in who have a child in need of social services, in need of programs that help our folks with disabilities and intellectual disabilities, and so we try to be a resource there. We have business leaders who come in who have issues with the sales tax receipts or the regulatory environment in Pennsylvania and helping us work through those issues. Parents who are concerned about the quality of their children's education. And then folks who are just interested in general, the economic environment, taxes, spending, and all of the drivers of economic activity in Pennsylvania. So it's a wide variety of issues that we confront.
Now, you were here as a staff member working within the House, so you got to see the building firsthand, you got to see the process firsthand. But what do you remember of your first swearing-in day as an elected official?
Oh, I'll always remember it. My son Jack was born in September of the year that I was elected, and so having my family here, my extended family here, grandparents were here, my son Jack, who will have no recollection beyond looking back at the pictures, because I think he was 3 or 4 months at the time of my swearing in. So it was just it was a wonderful day, but actually, and I've been here 4 years and still find myself just in awe of the beauty of this building, the history that is here. In fact, I was just in Washington, D.C. last week, and I was in the United States Capitol. Well, though the United States Capitol is much larger, our state capitol here is so much more impressive, I think, in terms of the architecture, the artwork. And so sitting in that House chamber and looking up and looking around and seeing the marble and the chandeliers and the wonderful artwork that is there, and then just realizing that you have been elected, I as a sitting House member have been elected on behalf of 63,000 residents back in Lancaster County to push that little button in front of me on their behalf, looking out for their best interests, looking out for the interests of the Commonwealth. That's an incredible thing, an incredible trust that has been given to each and every one of us. And so taking that oath of office, placing my left hand on the Bible, and swearing an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States and our Commonwealth, I'll never forget it, never forget that experience.
Did you have someone who was here sort of serving as a mentor to sort of help you through the process initially, whether that someone from your delegation in Lancaster or someone that was sitting around you that sort of helped you through the process? I've
been fortunate my entire life to have had access to wonderful role models and mentors. And I have always in my life sought out mentors. when I was in the military. When I was in college, I had a elderly gentleman just passed away a couple of years ago, who was a host parent of mine when I was a cadet at the Citadel, who I looked to, who was Cadwallader Jones, Quaddy Jones, who was just he and his wife Lucy were just tremendous influences on my life at such an important time. And it's been no different here. In fact, I started asking the question before I was even elected, as I interacted with folks up here in Harrisburg. Talk to me about the folks, either side of the aisle, Republican or Democrat, whether I agree with them ideologically, whether I agree with them on the issues, who would you point to and say these are the folks who do it right, and that you would encourage me to observe and to learn from? And actually, Chairman Clymer, Paul Clymer, who's retiring this year, chairman of the House Education Committee, was actually one of the first names that someone had mentioned to me. And so I've looked to Paul. And this institution, the House, is going to miss him, certainly. We're a better place because of his service here. The Lancaster County delegation has been a tremendous, now there's been a lot of turnover in the last 4 years of the Lancaster County House delegation. But when I first came in, Scott Boyd, Dave Hickernell, Brian Cutler, who I had worked with. Brian and I have a very unique relationship, just the nature of going through the campaign that we went through, and then my working with him, and we have a long history, and sort of our relationship through that campaign, in which we were both potential candidates, was really tested in a pretty unique way, as I mentioned, in terms of keeping our own selfish interest, our own self-interest in check, and what was in the best interest of the broader community. And so he is certainly still a mentor to me, and he knows the procedures of this House very well, the parliamentary procedures, the rules of our House, the legislative process, and so I've learned the amendment process, for example. He knows that process very well. So coming in, that was a tremendous benefit. And I was able to focus, because of my past experience running a district office, I had experience there, and I had an idea of what I thought a district office operation should look like. Plus, I hired some of Representative True's staff who stayed on, and so that transition, that was fairly seamless, and I was able to get that up and running very quick. So I was able to focus more energy on learning the ropes here and the process here very early on, and I think that has helped in terms of the measure of effectiveness that I think I've had in the short time that I've been here.
A process that is not quite as well known as a huge part of the legislative process is working through the committees. Mm-hmm. Coming in as a freshman member, talk to me about the selection of the committee process and then working through the committee process over the last 4 years and how that is sort of essential to getting legislation passed. Mm-hmm.
We have a wish list process, or essentially not long after it's a remarkable thing actually, you're elected. You usually find out you're elected late on a Tuesday night, and then very early the next morning you're getting phone calls. You're getting phone calls from staff here in the Capitol who are eager to get you up here, to assign temporary parking, temporary office space, to get your security badge, and to get the process rolling for you to have staff hired to have your district office lease signed. There's a lot of work to do in a very short window of time before you actually go on the payroll December 1st, and then are sworn in January. So it's a blur of activity in those first few hours, first few days after election. At the same time, folks who are running for caucus leadership positions, for Speaker of the House, for leader, they're calling you and asking for support because that election is held within a week, usually of the general election. So that's a blur of activity surrounding that. And then you're given a sheet of paper where you're essentially asked to write down which committees you would like to serve on. And I think all of us who are elected have an area of, have some background, have an area of expertise perhaps, or certainly areas of policy interest that tends to drive committee assignments, as well as what's in the best interest of your district. What types of industry, business, what does your district look like, and that often informs which committees you're assigned to. One of the other things we've done in Lancaster County with our Lancaster County House delegation is we've actually begun to have conversations. We have one of the larger delegations here in the House, and we've actually had conversations amongst ourselves as to which committee assignments we should seek and take. The reason for that is we want to try to cover, the 7 of us in Lancaster County, try to cover as much ground as we possibly can in terms of the influential committees here in Harrisburg. And so what happens essentially is that we have subject matter experts on issues because of these committee assignments. And so I know, for example, Dave Hickernell, if there's a bill that I have that's in transportation or a bill that I'm being asked about by my constituents in the Transportation Committee, Dave is usually my go-to person on where that bill is at and what the prospects for passage are. I have sort of served that in that capacity for our delegation on education issues. So when I first came in, I'm trying to recollect, because I actually had, between my first term and second term, some turnover. This term I've served on the Appropriations Committee and the House Education Committee, Labor and Industry, and Human Services Committee. And so I made some adjustments for my first term. The first term I was on Health, Labor and Industry, Finance, and Children and Youth in my first term. And so a lot of the legislative work that I've done, legislation that I've sponsored, has in fact been related to my committee work.
That's where I was going next. I'm glad you brought that up. Talk about some of the pieces of legislation that you sponsored and where the influences for those pieces of legislation came from.
Well, I've always had an interest in education policy. During my time in college, when I was a cadet at the Citadel, I was an education major. I actually thought that I would teach someday. When I got out of the Army, teach in our public schools. And so I did my student teaching and completed my degree in secondary education, social studies, was a social studies major. And student taught 8th grade American history at a inner city school in Charleston. So for a kid growing up from southern Lancaster County, that was a tremendous experience to teach at an inner city school in Charleston, South Carolina. And I thought about, when I got out of the Army, going back into education, but my life took me on a different path. My wife is a teacher. She has taught for 6 years. She's home now with our children. So I get to sort of live out, and she's a social studies teacher. So I sort of get to live that out through her. And each of the last few years before she stayed home with our kids, I would usually be invited to come in and teach her class for a day. And so I enjoyed spending that time interacting with students. So I have a real interest in education policy and education quality. Of course, those issues have been front and center in the time that I've been here. From the first budget here to other initiatives. And I think as you talk to constituents back home, as I talk to families, very high among their list of priorities is the quality of our schools. And so I've worked in that area. I authored legislation that put in place a new teacher evaluation system. I sponsored that bill, and that bill was signed. Not that my bill was, my language was inserted into the education code, so it wasn't ultimately my bill that was signed into law, but it was my language that was signed into law and is now being implemented. That happened in my first term. I'm extremely proud of that work. It was a real work of consensus, working across the aisle. It was bipartisan legislation, and to think that after it was initially introduced, it was extremely controversial. But to see it pass in bipartisan fashion and to see it being implemented now, and I think in most places being implemented very well. And I think improving the quality, improving the teaching profession, enhancing the teaching profession, I should say, I believe will drive student achievement in years to come. So I've worked on that legislation. I've also passed legislation. Was my bill signed into law that improved the regulatory environment for the commercial modular industry. That was this term. I've also sponsored legislation to enhance online learning opportunities, creating an online clearinghouse of courses for students all across the Commonwealth to take advantage of. So I've worked on issues that are labor and industry related, improving the regulatory environment in Pennsylvania. I worked on legislation as part of the child welfare package. That was an important package, I think was signed into law last year. And then, of course, a number of initiatives to improve the quality of our schools through rigorous academic standards, systems of transparency and accountability, educator effectiveness, and then expanding course choice to our students.
Outside of the legislation that you've authored, there's numerous amount of large topics being debated in the House currently. You're looking at property taxes, pension reform. Marcellus Shale is still an issue.
Mhm.
Transportation, we just passed a large transportation bill last term. How has being a sitting representative, sitting in all those debates on those such huge issues, some have yet to be resolved, has that discouraged you, encouraged you in the process?
Mhm.
And also, do you foresee some answers to these big questions in the future?
There are days when it's discouraging being here, no doubt about it. When we have, in my view, such critical issues to confront, where I think there's widespread agreement that these issues must be confronted, whether it be property tax reform, pension reform, I think is the most critical at this point in time, but yet cannot come to an agreement on what the solution is. And when you see what I think far too often, frankly, is a lack of political leadership and political courage. The reality is that many of these issues, and pension reform is just first and foremost in my mind right now, are so much bigger. All these issues, frankly, are so much bigger than us individually as an elected legislator. And we ought to be profiles in courage here. And I know it's a harder thing, much harder done than said. But we need political leaders who are willing to make the difficult decisions, put up the difficult votes, and at the end of the day, pay the political consequences for that, perhaps even lose an election. And I think we have far too many we've got great people here. And so I don't mean to sound so negative on the whole institution. I'm not. I've been fortunate to work with some talented, bright, noble folks. But we do have a lot of folks who are here who are interested in self-preservation and winning the next election and are hesitant to make any decision that might cost them electorally. And perhaps the benefits of being a legislator are too good in terms of the pension, the benefits that we earn. And I think there's some adjustments that need to be there, that need to be made to reform the culture here in Harrisburg that would lend itself to legislators making more difficult decisions and being willing to go back home, to lose an election and go back home, but yet hold their head up high because they took on and found solutions to some of the great problems confronting us. But I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because I think after the pay raise debacle in 2005, the electorate, folks back home, have become even more aware of what's happening in state government. There's greater transparency, and they're holding legislators more accountable for their actions. And as a result of that, there's been tremendous turnover, and I think you've had a newer generation of legislators that have come into office after 2006, that I think that gives me real hope that we will make progress, whether it's reforming the culture here in Harrisburg and whether it's folks that are willing to take on difficult issues and ultimately lose an election taking on an issue like pension reform. Progress, you learn very early here that progress sometimes is 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And you have to be willing to operate in that environment. Doesn't mean you don't get frustrated. I do, as I've said, but we need folks who are going to continue to charge ahead, to show real exercise real leadership, to demonstrate real political courage, and have a long-term vision. Sometimes we charge up the hill, use a military analogy, charge up the same hill we've charged up before, only to run into the same machine gun nest that we ran into before. Rather than having a long-term vision of how do we get there from here and take some of the small incremental steps we need to take to build consensus, to build momentum, to build the political will to advance an issue like property tax reform or pension reform. And so I'm hopeful that we're going to get there. So I'm hopeful, but without a doubt, there are days when I go home and I'm frustrated. But that inspires me, frankly, to do more and to work harder.
You came in sort of on the tail end of the wave of reform post-2005, but a lot of reforms have been initiated since that time. whether through the House rules or through the committee process. Have those reforms gone far enough, and are there additional reforms that are needed, whether it's downsizing the legislature, whether it's another constitutional convention? What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's more to be done. I mean, I think those were good first steps. But whether it's having legislators pay a portion of their salary to pay for benefits. After 2010, my class and after newly elected legislators were put into the same class of employees as per Act 120 with regard to the pension multiplier and how our pension is calculated. We're treated just as every other public sector employee across the state. I think those are important reforms. I think ending the abuse with the car lease program and the auto fleet. I think that was an important step. So I think there have been important steps taken, more transparency around the process and 24-hour waiting periods between consideration of bills in the House, wrapping up our business at 11 o'clock at night rather than going into the wee hours of the morning, shining more light on what's happening here. All those are important steps. I think there's more that ought to be done. I think in terms of the per diem system, I think needs to be done away with. I think legitimate receipts should be honored, but you should produce receipts and not just be awarded a per diem. I think that's important. I think having legislators contribute more towards their pensions, in fact, transitioning legislators into a defined contribution system, into a 401k type system, away from the defined benefit system, I think we could set the example and lead the way in doing that. I've supported reducing the size of the legislature. I think that would make the body more efficient, more effective. So I've supported each of the terms that I've been here. In the first session and the second session, have supported legislation to reduce the size of the legislature. I think we ought to term limit committee chairmanships. I think to have a stronger rotation in terms of who is chairing committees. I think that would improve the process. I frankly think that would be a way to get at term limits, which I support, without necessarily going through the constitutional amendment process to do that, because I think what you would have is chairman, after their time as chairman of a significant committee, would most likely, I think, would move on. There would be incentive to do that. So I think there are many other reforms that we should take a look at, and should I have the opportunity to come back in the Senate next session, certainly is something that I intend to continue to pursue.
You're young enough that you came in as an elected official where computers were already up and running. Social media was already initiated and being very active. So you have dealt with that the entire time that you were here. What ways has technology and social media either been an advantage for you or disadvantage in doing your service and doing your work?
I think overall it's been a value add to the process. Again, I think there's a greater transparency and accountability to the entire process, because the public back home can have very easy access to all that is happening here, and I think that's a good thing. The public can have the access to an individual legislator has been enhanced because of digital technology. I've been active through social media, Facebook and Twitter since I've been here, and so I interact with constituents. I can provide information in real time through social media. We have a website that the public utilizes, and we utilize. The public can access me personally by email at any time of the day, any day of the week. I answer all of my email messages personally. That's at times, certain times of the year in which there's a lot of activity here in Harrisburg in particular, particularly if it's controversial legislation, becomes a challenge, because I get behind and I'm not able to maintain my personal standard in terms of the speed at which I'm able to respond to someone. But the constituent can know that it's me and my thoughts that they're hearing when they read. So and I, as a result of that, since I've sort of have come into this job in the digital age, I think I put probably a lot of pressure on myself also to always be accessible. And so for example, I will occasionally find myself in trouble when I'm date night with my wife or out at dinner, and I'll look at my iPhone or previously my BlackBerry, and I've had my wife call me out on that before, saying, "Are you on a date with me or your phone?" My first year that I was here, my first term in the first year, the very first day, my summer vacation, our family goes to Bethany Beach, extended family every summer, and I had my phone in my swimsuit, dove into the ocean, first day, the phone was fried. That was the best vacation I had because I couldn't look at my phone. So there are challenges in terms of rules that need to be put in place so that I'm being the husband and the father that I need to be. But I think overall, as I said, I think in terms of the access, in terms of the transparency and the accountability. Now, I think on the other hand, there are challenges in that folks have access to all sorts of information via the internet, not all of which is accurate. And so, I'm sent things from constituents all the time they get very upset about, which a simple fact check will point to the inaccuracy of the information. And so there's a lot of inaccurate information, there's a lot of misconceptions, poor assumptions being made off of bad information. And so that's a challenge that the broader public is facing in everyday life. I've been a real advocate of online learning, hybrid learning, using digital content and providing an individualized and customized learning for our students. But that's a challenge that our teachers, our educators have in coaching our young people how to properly use all of the information that is out there, and not all of it is good. I also think we have a generation of increasingly poor writers because speaking in 140 characters via Twitter does not lend itself to good writing, and so I think something is being lost there. So I do think overall it's a value add, but without a doubt there are some challenges as a result.
A theme through your time as an elected official has been timing. Timing now, you've chosen to leave the House to run for a Senate position.
Mm-hmm.
That has opened up.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about that thought process, deciding to make that jump, and how that campaign has been sort of different than running
mm-hmm.
for the House.
Mm-hmm.
Larger district, larger area, different constituencies, and that. Could you comment on that?
Mm-hmm. Running for the Senate has been the most difficult decision I've had to make in terms of a career decision, in terms of my profession, since I decided to get out of the Army, to leave the Army back in late 2003. I love serving in the Army, and I love the soldiers, and I love the work. It was incredibly fulfilling work, and I really struggled for months. And in fact, I have a journal from my time in Iraq, and it's almost comical. You go back and you read that journal. There are some days that I was writing, and I had firmly decided that I was staying in. I was going to stay in the Army and go to the Captain's Career Course, which would have been the next step for me. And then the very next day, or 2-3 days later, I'm ready to go home. I'm ready to do something else, and I went back and forth numerous times. Well, the process to decide to run for the Senate was similar. I've had a job for the last 4 years that I have absolutely loved. I look forward getting up each day and getting to the office and confronting what new challenges await. I've enjoyed working with my colleagues. I've enjoyed working with my staff. I've enjoyed the interaction with the constituents. As a House member, you really can have real, meaningful, personal interaction with so many of your constituents. It's small enough, as I've said, where I can respond by email personally to every constituent that contacts me. You begin to lose that the larger the district is. And so I've loved the job, and the very week that Senator Brubaker announced, and he sort of surprised, at least he surprised me, but I think he surprised most when he announced that he wasn't going to run for re-election. And he announced very early. He announced almost now a year and a half ago that the announcement was made. My wife and I had just returned home from the hospital, she giving birth to our second child, a daughter, June. And so I immediately had folks reaching out to me, contacting me saying, "We think you ought to do this. These opportunities don't come up that often. You're well positioned, you're well qualified. We think you'd be great. You ought to run. What do you say?" And my response immediately and for the first few months was, "Listen, this is something I'm going to have to talk to my wife, Kate, about, and now is not the time for us to have the conversation." So I wasn't sure the timing really did make sense. in terms of the Senate run initially. And in fact, not unlike when I was leaving the Army, I haven't kept a journal. I regret that I haven't. But I haven't kept a journal through my years in the House. But if I had, and you went back and read it, you would see a very similar thought pattern where I was in, I was out, I was interested, I wasn't interested. But it became apparent through last summer and fall, as I was closing in on a decision, that I was receiving enough feedback, and I was very intentional this time, very intentional, about not seeking input, where I took a period of time, about 3 months, where I did very little calling. I did not reach out to supporters, to folks to ask whether or not I should run. I just listened. And because I wanted to see who was contacting me unsolicited. You get a more honest assessment, I think, that way. And I had folks who I respect tremendously, leaders in the community, all walks of life in the community, who were contacting me, encouraging me to do it. And the common theme was, we need people who can lead. We need people who can get results. We need folks who are going to be assertive, who are going to be decisive, who can articulate a vision, and who can get results with regard to the very real challenges that confront us as a state. And I just received enough of those phone calls that I began to pay greater and greater attention. And again, thought this is bigger than me. The issues that confront us are so much bigger than any one of us individually. And so at the same time, I was having a conversation with my wife, with my family, because I needed her to be 100%. I knew that Kate would say, I'll support you in whatever you want to do. That's not good enough for something like this. I needed her to say, I'm with you, we're in this together, and I want you to run. And so she finally got to that place. I had a sense of my mission, of my purpose, to provide leadership, to have a greater impact in the state Senate, and so ultimately decided to run. And I made that decision in late November, early December of 2013. And so it was a difficult decision, and I went back and forth many times. But I'm excited about the opportunity to do more on behalf of the residents of Lancaster County.
What aspects of your job as a House member did you enjoy the most? And then conversely, the least?
My gut reaction is I loved it all. I'm sure that's not the case. But I've loved the interaction with constituents. I've met some of the most fascinating, inspiring people. Just for example, that I could name 20 constituents right off the top of my head that I've met with that have inspired me in some way. Very early in my term, Barbara Bernard came to visit me in my district office. And she identified me. I'm her state representative, but she also was interested in coming to meet me because I was a veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom. And her son, Sergeant First Class Adams, was killed in Iraq, in Ramadi, Iraq, in 2005. And so she came, she gave me a hug, gave me a Gold Star Mother's coin, and proceeded to tell me about her son. And then proceeded in a very unassuming way to tell me about herself. And after her son was killed, she resolved that she wanted to serve, in honor of her son, serve other families who were going through or who were about to go through the same experience that she had, receiving the unimaginable horror of the news that her son had been killed in Iraq. And she joined the Gold Star Mothers. And so since 2006, she travels and she attends military funerals to be a support to the families going through their moment of grief. And I think about how that must, going to those funerals and seeing those families going through unimaginable grief, how that must remind her daily, weekly, monthly of her own experience. But she has chosen to channel her grief into service to these families. She is just now the recent past president, National Gold Star Mothers. folks like that who I meet who are just doing so much good to serve the broader community, to serve our country, to serve our state. And it's an absolute inspiration. It reminds me about why I do what I do. That I've loved. I've loved touring schools. I love visiting with educators who are, so many of them, just pouring their hearts, their energy, all of their intellect into serving young people, many of them coming from having such significant hurdles to their own education. They inspire me. Meeting young people, meeting students who are working hard and accomplishing great things in our schools. So the interaction with constituents, first and foremost, I've loved. And I've loved the interaction with folks who don't agree with me. I've had wonderful relationships because I've worked on education policy, much of it controversial, and having teachers who will come into my office very angry with something I've done or I've proposed, and then sit down and we have a conversation. I have an opportunity to share my perspective. They have an opportunity to share theirs, and walking away from that conversation having a relationship of trust, understanding that we may fundamentally disagree, but we both have a greater understanding about one another's position. And so that has been a real blessing. And I've loved being able to get into the weeds on some of the important issues that have confronted us here in Harrisburg. I can't think of a single thing I haven't liked about it. Maybe, and I alluded to this earlier, occasionally I get frustrated with the pace. I think an issue is non-controversial, demands action, and yet we can't quite build the consensus to advance the legislation. Oftentimes ego gets in the way, politics gets in the way. That's frustrating, and so, but that just inspires me to work harder, frankly. So even that, I don't know that I get frustrated by it, but it's not that I don't enjoy it.
Well, then are there regrets or disappointments you're leaving behind in your House service, or whether legislatively, procedurally, that you're not necessarily leaving behind or taking with you if you are elected into the Senate?
There are things that I look back on in terms of policy that I think we should have accomplished and wish we would have accomplished in the 4 years. And if I'm given the opportunity to go over to the Senate, then I'll certainly continue to work on those issues. And if I'm retired at the end of the year, I'll probably continue to shout from the sidelines that we need real action on property tax reform. At the heart of that is fixing what I think is a flawed funding formula, and how we distribute funding from the state level to our local school districts. And many constituents don't quite understand the connection between those two issues. And usually when I explain it, they get even more angry in terms of how the process currently plays out. But we need to fix a flawed funding formula, ensure that our school districts across the Commonwealth, particularly our growing school districts, are treated fairly, and reform a property tax system that says to folks who've long since, after they've owned their homes, essentially says to them, you don't really own your home, because if you don't pay your property tax bill, we're going to take your house. So that's an issue. The lack of real progress on meaningful pension reform. We're staring at a $50 billion unfunded liability. That's a regret that we've not dealt with that yet. I'm hopeful in the closing days of the session maybe we'll take something up, but certainly we need to work on that should I come back. Lack of movement on prevailing wage reform and other unfunded mandates. There was a real opportunity, I think, in the first session, the first term that I was here, because I think we were so close to having the votes necessary to reform the prevailing wage, at least give greater local control over prevailing wage. But we just fell short and didn't have the vote. So I do have some policy regrets, but again, that's just inspired me to work harder through the course of the Senate campaign, and once I get to the Senate, should I go to the Senate, to continue to work on those issues and more.
What lesson or lessons have you learned about the politics or the people of Pennsylvania during your short term as an elected official?
It's an incredibly diverse state. I think certainly growing up in Lancaster County, you sometimes think that everybody thinks the way we do. And that then feeds the frustration. Why is this so hard to move some of the issues, and I just talked about them. Pension reform, property tax reform, prevailing wage reform, liquor privatization, you name it. Any issue that is controversial is oftentimes less partisan and more geographic, particularly the property tax issue is a perfect example of this. It's more geographic in nature because of the diverse population of our state. And so a Republican in the southeast part of Philadelphia and the suburbs of Philadelphia does not look and think like a Republican from Lancaster County because the folks they represent don't look and think like residents of Lancaster County. And Democrats who from the western part of the state versus the southeast don't think the same and view policy through the same lens. And so I think I have a greater appreciation for that and how difficult governing is because of how diverse our state is. But I think we're a better people because of that. And again, going back to sort of a theme on leadership, it just requires greater political leadership to do what's in the best interest of the taxpayers and the Commonwealth as a whole.
What advice would you give someone who's interested in running for elected office? Would you advise them, how would you advise them to get involved?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to be engaged on the issues and be engaged with people and not to be afraid of people who may disagree with you. I think that will make you a more well-rounded person and better informed. But to get into the weeds on issues that are of real importance. Again, one of the concerns with the growth and the popularity of digital technology, we have access to so much information, but if our understanding doesn't reach more than 140 characters on Twitter, something is being lost. And so I think to seek greater understanding of the issues, to be engaged with your elected officials, to be engaged with your friends and neighbors in your community. That's the first place to start, is really begin to build a relationship with your neighbors and friends, be community focused, and then seek opportunities to serve, wherever that would be. Run for seats in town council, run for the school board, run for the legislature. I encourage folks to do it. We need, the turnover is healthy. We need bright men and women who are interested in serving for a period of time. And so anybody that's thinking about doing it, I would encourage them. And then be bold, show courage, don't be afraid to lose, and ultimately be selfless, understanding that the people we serve and the issues are far more important than us as individuals.
It's so hard to look ahead into the future. But do you see yourself as an elected official for a long period of time, or do you look at some other vocation that you have interest in getting back to, like you said, teaching or something to that effect?
I've thought some about this. I don't have like some long-term master plan. When I look back over the last, really 6-7 years, if someone would have told me when I was running Brian Cutler's campaign that over the course of the next 8 years, you were going to go from clerk of courts to succeed Katie True in the House of Representatives to the state Senate, I would have laughed. I would not have seen that path. I could not have anticipated, I could not have planned this out. And so I don't know what the next 8, 10, 15 years holds. My goal has always been to go where I can have the greatest level of influence. Having kids since I've been here, our son Jack and daughter June, our 2 children, is a daily reminder to me as to why I'm doing this. I'd like to think that in the time that I'm here, whether it's 4 years, whether it's 8 years, 12 years, what have you, that I will serve in a way, leave them a legacy they can be proud of, and will make life a little better for them, and pass on a stronger state to my children and grandchildren. That's all what motivates me. I am 37, I'll be 38 in December. And so my assumption is when I get into my mid-40s that if I'm going to move into a second career, that's the time to do it. And I'd like to do that. I just personally have the goal. I'd love to run a business someday. Get back into the private sector at some point. I think turnover is good. But I'm going to be very interested, obviously, in what those I serve, what they think. I want to be effective. I'd like to think that I'll know when I've lost my effectiveness, or my effectiveness has been diminished, and perhaps it's time for me to move on. Yeah, take it one step at a time. Try to have the greatest impact I can. Be bold, show courage, be selfless, and see where that leads.
That sort of bridges into my final question. How would you like your term as a State House member to be remembered?
Mm-hmm. I'd like to be remembered for being serious, for coming here and working very hard on behalf of those who entrusted me with this opportunity, to work very hard on behalf of them. I'd like to be remembered for having a strong constituent service and outreach program in the district, for being responsive to constituents who had need of their state representative and the services our office can provide. I'd like to be remembered for, in a short period of time, taking on big issues, consequential issues, controversial issues, and not shying away from those fights, being able to work across the aisle and to get results on issues that really matter to folks. So, and all of that on behalf of, again, those who trusted me to come here. And I'll always be grateful, whether my time in Harrisburg ends on November 30th, I'll always be grateful for the time that I've had here.
I want to thank you again for taking the time to sit and chat with us today. I wish you lots of luck in your future endeavors.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.